Hi guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Rumours are emerging that Red Bull have made their driver decisions for the 2026 season, and Isack Hadjar, following his podium at the Dutch Grand Prix, will indeed be getting the promotion to be Max Verstappen's teammate. Could this be a big mistake? Yet again, are Red Bull putting a guy into the car too early, earlier than he should have been? But what especially does it mean for Yuki Tsunoda? Almost certainly, it seems, based on these reports, out of the Red Bull Racing seat, but surprisingly still an opportunity maybe for him to return to the sister team. Should he do that, or should he go to Alpine if that is a possibility? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Lots of updates today. We're going to start with the Baku Grand Prix coming up in a couple of days' time this weekend. Charles Leclerc has stuck it on pole every single qualifying session here for a very long time, including the sprint in 2023. Did he win any of these? Unfortunately, no. And the wait goes on for Charles to win around Baku. It was, of course, a year ago that the Baku Grand Prix happened last time, and famously Oscar Piastri took an amazing victory after the dive bomb onto Charles into turn 1. But I think Charles Leclerc was relatively confident that he was going to get that position back. But as we now very famously know, that rear wing on the McLaren were doing some interesting things, let's say, during that Grand Prix. And this was now a rather infamous tweet, which was pretty much put out a year ago when that, let's say, mini DRS was first exposed. And McLaren eventually said, okay, I guess we'll stop. Remarkably enough, of all the champions around Baku since we have raced there is only one repeat winner, and that repeat winner's name is Sergio Perez. I will say, this weekend, if Red Bull want a result out of their second car, they might be wise to put Perez in for Yuki, just for a weekend, right? Because Perez is excellent around Baku. His driving style suits this circuit very well. His strength out of some of the 90-degree slower speed corners when the car's got to be set up a little bit more for performance on the rear axle rather than on the front. Last year, he was outperforming Max. He was faster than Max during the Grand Prix, and it looked like he was set for a podium. And then, as we know, the incident with Carlos Sainz at the end of last year's race, which in hindsight could well have cost Ferrari last year's Constructors' Championship. It is always interesting to look at. Hamilton's won here only once. Ricciardo, Rosberg, Bottas, Verstappen, Piastri. So looking at this list, if this continues, that Perez is the only repeat winner. We're looking at Norris. We're looking at, who knows, maybe Charles Leclerc. Could this be the time? I wouldn't hold out too much hope. This weekend is expected to be, of course, look, maybe George Russell could do some damage in the Mercedes, but I'd say relatively unlikely. It is nonetheless set to be a relatively clean weekend in terms of weather, bit of sun, bit of clouds, relatively neutral in terms of temperatures. Not cool exactly that the Mercedes would like, but probably not atrociously hot. So that's the update on the weekend. But another big update arriving today was around the sprint calendar for 2026. So they've confirmed the rounds that are going to have the sprints, and I will say it's an interesting selection of Grand Prix. So China's going to get one again. We're going to have Miami. We're going to have Montreal as well, actually. So that's pretty interesting. And the last three, look, it's Silverstone. We've done it there before. We're going to do it there again, it seems. The Netherlands. And then the remarkable one to me, and I'm sure many of you guys will agree, is Singapore. Of all the tracks to do a sprint, I wouldn't have expected Singapore to be at the top of the list. But we know that the promoters do enjoy a sprint, not because it necessarily sells more tickets, but because they can charge higher prices for said tickets because there's more actual meaningful on-track action. So it seems a lot of the organisers are very heavily pushing for the sprints. But the back end of the season, basically everything is changing here, right? Because this year we had China and Miami, but we also then had Spa, we have Austin coming up, Brazil and Qatar, right? And in previous years, we've seen around Austria and circuits like that as well at Spielberg. But next year is going to be quite dramatically different as the season goes on. Like a return of a sprint to Silverstone. I think the racing at Silverstone is always great, so I'm not necessarily going to oppose that dramatically. You guys know my opinions on sprints. I'm not the biggest fan of them. I prefer the current format than what we used to have, but it's still not ideal. It gives you too much of a hint as to what's actually going to happen on the Sunday. But a Singapore sprint, that I think is the big question, right? Because, okay, imagine that they said that we were going to do a Monaco sprint. It's like, what are we talking about here, right? Surely that can't be the way to go. But Singapore is not far off in terms of difficulty to overtake. It's not entirely impossible, but you need a relatively big tyre delta. Tend to be Singapore is a one-stop race unless there's a safety car that makes it possible to do a two-stop. So it's obviously that's not even relevant for the sprint anyway. So I can't imagine that weekend in October next year is going to be especially riveting, but I guess we shall see. Now they've also confirmed all of the start times for all of the Grand Prix, and one important note is that the Canadian Grand Prix is going to be run now much later in the day than normal to accommodate for the Indy 500 because it's happening on the same weekends. Indy usually happens early afternoon out, of course, in Indianapolis. So the plan is going to be in Montreal to actually have it later in the day so that motorsport fans can watch both, which is going to be a great afternoon of motorsport. Typically, Indy 500 falls on the same weekend as Monaco, but that's changing next year. And usually, at least if you're in the States, you watch Monaco in the morning and then the Indy 500. And if you're in Europe, you watch Monaco in the early afternoon and then the 500 in the evening. So this is going to be another way to make that work. But I think people are understandably questioning that, look, sprints might not be great. I'm not a big fan of them, but the occasional sprints, I don't hate it as a format. Certainly from a content perspective, it at least gives a little bit more to discuss. And Interlagos has been a pretty good venue full stop over the last few years for it, I would argue. And, well, Singapore is now going to have it instead. So some major questions about whether that's fair. Even Esteban Ocon was very public in his dismissal of sprint races over the last few days, suggesting we live in a consumer world where we seek out content more often. We watch a Netflix series and don't want to wait between seasons. At the same time, sometimes it's important to wait patiently and enjoy the Grand Prix. So I think Ocon has a similar mentality to Alonso and to myself as to like instead of catering to the reduction of attention span or whatever you want to say of the younger generation, maybe it's actually worthwhile for the sport to maintain its culture and its integrity. And understandably, with the prevalence of sprints now, there was some talk from the fans, and you know, this got a fair bit of traction to say, look, fans tend to want cheaper tickets. They tend to not be a big fan of sprint races, at least watching from home. But F1, because it makes sense from a monetary perspective, adding more races, making them more expensive, and not necessarily that's on F1. The organizer gets to decide. You know, the races being shorter has been a conversation thrown around, although I think that's pretty unlikely to actually happen. More sprints, good sprints are gone. Singapore becomes a sprint. You know, there are lots of questions as to whether this is a good idea. These are those start times I mentioned, by the way. A couple of relevant ones. So Netherlands is going to get a sprint next year, as we just saw. That's going to start midday on that Saturday. Just quickly to note, you guys will see here that the Madrid Grand Prix is on the 13th of September. Italy's on the 6th of September, so that's a Sunday, that's a Sunday. 2 weeks after, though, on the 29th of September next year, is going to be Azerbaijan. So you might think, well, hang on, why is it only 13 days? That is because next year's Azerbaijan Grand Prix is taking place on a Saturday because there's a national holiday Sunday. So they're moving it back a day, which is interesting, and just keep that in mind, I suppose, when you put it into your diary. But Singapore, right? We're doing a sprint in Singapore. The race starts at 8 p.m. local time. The sprint is going to start at 5 p.m. local time, which is kind of early in the sense that it's going to be hot. Right? Okay, it's hot in Singapore anyway, as we know. But the drivers, they go through it, right? That race that evening is one of the most physically demanding races. Extremely humid, extremely hot, even though it's a nighttime race. Good luck trying to do that in the daytime. And running the sprint, and yes, it's only a sprint, but running it at 5 p.m., it does mean the drivers are going to be under some level of physical turmoil, I would imagine, even by the end of that sprint. But those are the updates. That's pretty much what we have on the day on the F1 update side. Although it's also got to be said that there will be discussions, can you believe it, shock horror, about introducing not only more sprints. There was a rumour the other day that they're looking to expand potentially to 10 sprints for 2027. Now there's talk they might look to expand to 12 sprints, which, look, it is probably inevitable the way that things are going that does happen at least at some point. But what about the other idea of reverse grid sprints from 2027 with the teams and the drivers? Now, doing a reverse grid for a sprint is logistically already you've got to run through the potential challenges of that. You've got to find a way to make the drivers still want to qualify in the correct order. The only way really to do that is for qualifying to set the order for the main Grand Prix, and then you reverse the grid based on that, right? But the current format that wouldn't really work for, because currently we have a sprint qualifying. So if you do a sprint qualifying, but you know that the grid's going to get reversed, then it's going to be a race to the bottom, right? So the only real way to do it is like what they do in F2, where there is one qualifying session that sets the grid for Sunday or for the main race, and then the grid is, at least in F2, F3, pretty much half reversed, where they take the top 10 positions and they swap them around. So if you qualified first for Sunday, then you still start first on Sunday, but you end up starting 10th in the sprint. That is one way to think about it, but like, do we want more sprints? Do we especially want a Singapore sprint where the grid is reversed and you just drive around behind one another because you don't want to take risk of overtaking? I don't know. It doesn't strike me like a good idea. F1 is going to discuss it. Domenicali says that initially the reaction from the teams and the drivers was overwhelmingly negative. Now the reaction is slightly more neutral, so we will see where we go from here. But let's talk about the Red Bull update. We know that Max Verstappen has not been a big fan of the format changes over the last couple of years, but it looks like Red Bull indeed will look to promote Arvid Lindblad to Racing Bulls. Now, it's a very interesting time next season. Some teams will say, such as let's say Williams, better to keep the driver lineup as it is. Sainz and Albon know what the driver lineup is, not have to worry about anything on that regard, and focus fully on delivering the best possible car. Other teams, such as Red Bull, might well argue that next year is a bit of a reset in terms of the car. Over the last few years, it's difficult to deny that the car at Red Bull has become increasingly, let's say on the nose. It's very sharp at the front ends. It's been moving in that direction to such an extent that it seems that no other driver can handle it apart from Max. And the trend, it seems, has become pretty clear over the last couple of years that Perez started the regulation cycle in okay position. He wasn't great, but he wasn't terrible compared to Max, and it only got worse as time went on, even though at least Cadillac would argue that Perez is still just the same kind of quality driver that he used to be. It's just the car went away from him, and by the time Red Bull realised that it was actually going away from Max as well in terms of competitiveness, then it was all too little too late. They tried Lawson in the car, that backfired very swiftly. He'd done okay at Racing Bulls. They tried Yuki in the car, who had done frankly rather well at Racing Bulls or AlphaTauri over the last couple of seasons, and he found himself in almost an identical position. So, Arvid Lindblad is one of the key names in this discussion. He's been in Formula 2 this season for Red Bull. I will say he had a challenging weekend at Monza, to say the least. He shunted into Alex Dana at the Ascari chicane, took him out of the race, and then was it Roman Stanek he took out at the first corner a couple of minutes after that. So he had a really tough time in Monza, certainly during the main race where most of the eyes were on him. And he has been considered one of the upcoming potential prodigies of motorsport, in a similar way, maybe, to the way that Antonelli was viewed by Mercedes. This, of course, raises questions, because some would argue that Antonelli has been put into that Mercedes project too early. I'm still of the opinion that, when we look back in 4 to 5 years, that I don't think there will be regrets from Mercedes side as to doing this, but I can totally understand people arguing that Antonelli was put in too early, should have had another year in Formula 2, and you can absolutely make that case as it stands. Other drivers, let's say Max, they come in, they're very raw, they don't have, let's say a particularly consistent time of things, but it does help them, it does build them into the driver that they want to be. So it seems that Red Bull are still leaning in the direction of putting the younger talent straight into the car before potentially they are ready, and letting them get ready in Formula 1 machinery, which is why I still don't think Mercedes made a mistake signing Antonelli, but I think the way that they managed it, maybe some of the expectations, some of the pressure that they have implied at times, hasn't helped things at Mercedes. And yeah, Mercedes can say all they like, we stand by him, but then all of a sudden Toto says that he was very underwhelming, and it's taken a rather different approach. So it's all going on, but Red Bull seem convinced that Lindblad is the guy, that they want to give a shot to. They've clearly put a lot into his progress. He's done, I would say, pretty damn well, to be honest, in Formula 2, despite a difficult Monza. Yeah, could you give him another year down there? Sure, but Red Bull seem to believe it's better to put him straight into the car. To be honest, I was pretty convinced that they would do this now for some time. Maybe it turns out to be an error, but putting him straight into the Racing Bull seat, I think is probably a wise thing to do. You've got to keep that kind of next generation rolling. And Lindblad is one of the most exciting drivers Red Bull have had in some time. It is remarkable to think that Isack Hadjar was not considered to be an especially promising talent of Red Bull. And without Perez getting sacked and an opportunity opening up, it probably would have never happened for him potentially at Red Bull, or certainly even at Racing Bulls. But he's done such a good job that it seems that he's become impossible to deny. Nico Rosberg has made the point multiple times that if you're Hadjar, you do everything you can to not take that seat, to stay at Racing Bulls, don't go to Red Bull, and don't basically put your career straight on the line. And I agree with that assessment if next year's rules were the same as this year's rules, because I have no reason to believe that Isack Hadjar would handle that current RB21 better than Yuki can right now, or Lawson before him, or Perez at the end of last year with the RB20, right? I don't think that would happen, right? But what I do think is that going into next year, 2026, the things are resetting to a certain extent. Who knows how next year's cars are going to behave? There's a feeling that, you know, they may drive in a more neutral way, that a driver who doesn't have ungodly talent like Max could actually get along with reasonably well. So I think that if there is a time to go to Red Bull, the rules changing now is probably the time to do it. And Red Bull, it seems, are making this decision. And it makes sense from their perspective. He's been pretty much undeniable, right? Yuki hasn't been great. He apparently has a few more rounds to still prove himself, Yuki, but maybe that proving himself is whether we keep him on board at Racing Bulls or whether we just get rid of him entirely. And I don't really see the point in keeping him on at Racing Bulls, but according to AMUS, and maybe you could argue this season they've not been as reliable as always, but, you know, when Automotor and Sport talk about something, it's usually correct. They are pretty convinced that it's going to be Max and Hadjar in the Red Bull, it's going to be Lindblad in the Racing Bull +1, and that +1 is either going to be Lawson or it's going to be Yuki Tsunoda. Now, again, I don't really see the value in putting Yuki back down to the B team. I also think that if I'm Yuki, what's the point, right? Do you want to go back to the sister team hoping to get a promotion again at some point if Hadjar fails? Look, I guess it's a better option than not being on the grid at all, but there is this other outside possibility, especially because there are understandably big rumours about what the engines for next year are going to be like. Are Red Bull powertrains Ford cooking anything, or is it going to be atrocious? Who knows? But, you know, myself and many others don't have a lot of confidence in that Red Bull engine next year. The Racing Bulls next year could plausibly be the worst car on the grid, or not far away. If the Red Bull engine isn't very good, and Red Bull as a team are not a front runner, then you would expect the Racing Bulls, the AlphaTauri, whatever, to be significantly further down the order. Is that where you want to be, or would you prefer to go to Alpine with Gasly if you are Tsunoda? You've teamed with him before at AlphaTauri. They've got a Mercedes engine over there. There are reasons to believe why that could be viable, right? Would it make sense for Alpine? That's a good question. But if I'm Yuki, that's probably what I'm looking at right now. Or I'm looking to turn heads to such an extent over the next few rounds that Red Bull can't get rid of me. They have to keep me on board. But right now, given recent evidence, recent performances, I think that Red Bull's decision is probably 95% made, unless Yuki really delivers something pretty spectacular over the next few rounds, and if Hadjar has a horror show over the next few rounds, which is, again, unlikely, and even if that does happen, I think from Red Bull's perspective, they're like, look, Hadjar's done so much that it's impossible for us to not give him a go because of what he's done in his first year Racing Bulls. The podium in Zandvoort probably sealed his fate in some sense. Now, whether you think that is his fate being sealed, as in Red Bull is effectively a demotion in season right now for most drivers, probably the answer to that is yes. But next season, you'd still prefer to be at Red Bull than you would to be at the B team. There's no doubt about that. Now, as we say here, that McKees and Marco have kind of said, look, they've got until Mexico to decide. But would you be surprised if US are pretty much on the money here? So very much into your thoughts and all this stuff in the comments. Just one final thing. For those of you guys who are Oscar Piastri fans or, believe he's going to win the championship, last year, these next few Grand Prix were definitely challenging for Oscar. Now, of course, not Baku, right? But the US Grand Prix, the Mexican Grand Prix, he had a bit of a stinky stint towards the end of last season, Oscar. And it's interesting to think about, right? Whether that's going to happen again this year. Doesn't seem especially likely to me, because there were other tracks already this season where Oscar struggled with. Last year, that this year he was far better, if not winning outright or being faster than Lando. But it could well be argued that given the success that maybe Lando had with respect to Oscar at some of these tracks last season, these next few rounds are the opportunity for Lando to catch up. But obviously, Baku, you would think on paper, gives a pretty good opportunity for McLaren and Piastri to again extend their advantage. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.